Welcome to Paul or Nothing, the place to get all of your Paul all of the time. Join me, your host Sam Wiles, as we discover the history, the music, and the man behind it all, Paul McCartney. To get in contact with the show, email us at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Paul or Nothing, the place to get all of your Paul all of the time. Today is a day like any other. We're going through the life and music of Paul McCartney, and today we'll be focusing on Back to the Egg. I'm your host, Sam Wiles. First of all, thank you for tuning in, folks. Thank you for switching on. Thank you for downloading us on whatever mobile device you're using. I know I wasn't uploading episodes for a great while. I did a little bit of a confessional in the last podcast. Sorry if that was a little bit depressing, folks. But it's great to see that you were all here waiting for me when I did return, and it's great to feel the addictive prospects of podcasting once again, and it just feels awesome making this little show for you people out there, and I simply hope you're all enjoying it. If you want to get in contact with the show, if you have any suggestions for future episodes, maybe you want to warn me about a future album, maybe you disagree about something I said in a review, anything at all, drop us an email to paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. Actually, the one I really want to start hearing about from you folks is your own McCartney stories. This show is basically my own meta-Macca narrative, so I want you to get in on the action. When was the first time you heard a Paul McCartney song? The first time you bought one of his albums? The first time you saw him live? The first time you played some of his music? Maybe you've met him. Please send me your Paul McCartney story to paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. Obviously follow us on Twitter, which is @McCartneyPod. That's the central hub for the show, the best way to keep up to date. Also follow our blog. A lot of our episodes actually started out as blog posts on our sister website, which is www.paulmccartneypod.wordpress.com. That's www.paulmccartneypod.wordpress.com. Basically anything that I can't turn into an episode in the show, I'll probably just put into a little blog. It's the perfect little stewing pot for potential bonus episodes. And of course there are many more that never do become bonus episodes. They'll just be blog exclusives. So if you don't get enough of your McCartney fix from this show, obviously go and check that out. Links for all these will obviously be below as well. Check out the Facebook and YouTube simply by typing in Paul or Nothing or Paul McCartney Podcast. Please leave us an iTunes review, a 5-star iTunes review, wink wink, nudge nudge, say no more. And of course follow us on Patreon down below. If you want to get involved and be a part of the show and help us expand and help us grow, we're not desperate for money. The show isn't on the breadline or anything. It's just a small option out there for you folks. The show's always going to be free. If you ever think you'd like to buy me a coffee or buy me a beer, you can simply just do the same through the Patreon. Thank you very much, folks. Whew, glad we got that out of the way. For it really is a sad day, folks. A sad day indeed. As today is the day that we cover Wings' final release. It's been a long time coming, as you all know. And it means we're at the end of our first decade of McCartney's career, and around 25% of our way through this podcast. Although, just as a little peek behind the curtain moment, just to see how long it actually takes me to actually get around to making one of these actual podcasts, I began the notes for this episode on the 31st of October 2017. At the time of recording, it is February 23rd, 2018. Christ, I need to pull my finger out. Anyway, on with the show. Now, the thing about Back to the Egg is that at the start of my journey making this podcast, I was nowhere near as hesitant to explore it as I was several of the other Wings discography members, namely Speed of Sound, Red Rose, London Town, etc. This was because when I began this show, one of the interests I had was the downfall of Wings. Why did it collapse? How did it end the way it did? So, very much when I flipped to the very last page of Return of the King, when I got the Rings Trilogy book one Christmas, I decided to pop on Back to the Egg in those very, very early days of researching for the show, and it was kind of just like to see what my eventual point B would be as I was just about to set off from point A. When I first hit play, I wasn't really sure what was going to happen at all, really. Bearing in mind, I hadn't researched any of the backstory and Macca lore by this point, so I wasn't aware of the many semi-dramatic musical shifts and changes in direction that the band had up until this point. You know, all I had under my belt was McCartney, Ram, and Band on the Run, and a bit of Wings' Greatest as my reference points. I'm sure I'll go into much more detail later as to how many of the songs on this album were an instant turn-off for me. But the whole experience really was kind of that, like one big turn-off. It was shockingly different to me in terms of what I'd come to expect from this twee little pop band in a rock band's clothing. It was very hard to process. I didn't know how the band had got here or why. So, like I say, you know, despite the fact that I am the host of a mildly to poorly successful podcast, I really wasn't looking forward to reviewing those post-Band on the Run albums. But as we've seen time and time again, with Red Rose, with Wings at the Speed of Sound, to some degree, but definitely London Town, those albums, once they have a chance to grow on me and worm their way in, certain affections can blossom. Obviously no spoilers though, you'll have to carry on listening. But yeah, either way, I am glad I carried on. I'm glad I've gotten to this point B. The show has changed and grown oh so much since that time. Episodes are much longer now. Episodes are split into 2 parts now. The songs now bleed over the commentary. Just, little superficial differences. We didn't do bonus episodes back then. We didn't do interviews. I mean, we've been going over a year now. So much has changed from where I was when I started this podcast to where I am now, both as a podcaster and in terms of my personal life. I remember when we finished the Tom Waits podcast, Down in the Hole, I'm sorry I brought it up again, when I went back and listened to the very first episode of that show, I remember how short that was as well. That was like 1 hour and 15, and then we got up to Rain Dogs, and that was like 3 hours and 40 minutes and stuff. So clearly I have this habit of not being able to kill my darlings, as it were, and my podcasts seem to always get ever more expansive and expansive and expansive. And I know many of my friends and relatives have heard me moan about how long my shows are and why my editing takes so long and why I can't just trim it down. But obviously I've just got to squeeze all of this detail in. But yeah, it's funny now. Back to the Egg is now one of my go-to Wings albums when I'm out and about. Its reputation as an underrated Wings release is well deserved. At least I thought, that very, very certainly until Morris and London Town rolled around, and now the two, for me at least, are in a little bit of a hotly tossed up debate. I can't tell which one is more deserving of the title of the Lost Wings album. I'll actually be talking about this, the idea of the Lost Wings album, with my guest later, who will be helping me review this wonderful album, but more on him later. So, seeing as we are coming full circle somewhat for this first phase of the show at least, I guess you could say that we're going to go back to our own egg in some way. Or not, fuck it, whatever. Let's just crack on with the show, yeah? Hit it, Johnny! Getting the band back together again, and again, and again. It was now 1978, and London Town wasn't exactly the biggest splash in the water, was it, folks? Despite being recorded by the Band on the Run core trio of Paul, Linda and Denny. Now, Wings as a concept works better when it is a full band with a full lineup to support McCartney. Not just visually, but in the studio, and more importantly for the purposes of touring, something I know Denny was itching to get back into. If Wings were going to do another album proper and then a tour to support that album, Paul was going to have to grit his teeth and once again put together another band. Now, you think this would be easy enough for Paul, who has already put together so many incarnations of this band together over the years, but getting down to the nitty-gritty side of things, going out there, setting up shop in a little private room and auditioning people in a basement or something, seemed a little quaint and unnecessary now. It's almost like the Sugar Babes at this point. You can just change any iteration of the band and it's still the same band. It doesn't actually matter at this point who actually is in Wings. Maybe Paul knows this by this point, people only ever come to see him for him anyway, so why bother putting too much effort into sorting this band out? However, what Paul did have was a working musician partner whose opinion he more or less probably trusted at this point when it came to the band, and therefore the task of finding new bandmates, more or less again, fell into Denny Lane's hands. Paul first met guitarist Lawrence Juba earlier in 1977 in a bloke's toilets after being introduced to him by Lou Reed's bassist Herbie Flowers. After wiping their hands on their trousers, they shook hands and that was that. In the following 18 months, Lawrence kept on doing what he'd always been doing before he ever met Macca, namely absolutely shredding it on guitar and becoming somewhat of a virtuoso recording session darling in his own right. Then one night Denny saw Juba playing the solo to the Wings Over America version of Go Now, the Moody Blues song, and pretty much invited him to try out for the position of lead guitarist for Wings on the spot. To which Juba agreed, before rushing home to quickly borrow a few of his brother's Wings records so he could actually pass himself off as to having listened to the band in the first place. Of course, folks, for any of you who haven't listened to the episode already, you can go back and check out my interview with Wings guitarist Lawrence Juba on our 5th bonus episode. Still can't believe I actually got him to come on the show at all, to be fair. So yeah, thank you for that, Lawrence, if you're listening to this. Please go back and enjoy that insightful interview for any further details. What didn't come up during that interview, however, and I've recently found this out after reading Tom Doyle's fantastic book, Man on the Run. I've also got to get Tom Doyle on the show, actually. I'd better talk to Paul Sally. And I read in this book that Lawrence Juber's actually a strict vegetarian as well. Something that would have gone down a storm with the McCartneys. Again, big up Linda McCartney sausages, they are the best. Now, to go from wild boy party man Jimmy McCulloch to mild-mannered Lawrence Juber was probably the logical move for the band on paper, as it meant that A, there would be less controversies and less cock-ups, but it also meant that they would, be able to stay on time and stay off each other's nerves and dive into any and all genre that Paul would need Lawrence to whip out of his hat at any point. Although later with my guest, I will be discussing somewhat the idea that this is a great idea for Wings, but then for Wings to get Lawrence Juber and then do a punk album with him might be a certain waste of potential. Again, more on that later. Then from a chance meeting in a toilet, we go to a chance meeting in a pub where Denny bumps into the chap that would become the final drummer for Wings' last leg of life. Steve Holley was a young but veteran session drummer who had recently done some work on Elton John's hit single Ego. Now, the sources vary, but Steve either or met Denny in a chance encounter at this pub, or it was a chance encounter at a pub, then at a housewarming party, then they moved on to a housewarming party, or it was at the housewarming party, then they moved to the pub. But either way, the story ends in a jam with the McCartneys after all of this. When speaking reflectively of this, Holley said, "I just sat down and started playing. I think they just saw it as an easy way to get a replacement drummer rather than going through the long audition process." For what it's worth, Holley was a fantastic addition to the band in my opinion, and whilst he might not be as iconic or prolific as Joe English, but it's his output that stands tall. His work on songs like Goodnight Tonight, Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, Old Siam Sir, So Glad to See You Here, and Getting Closer allowed him to make an equally pronounced impact on the band's sound, and he rivals Denny Sywell for my favourite Wings drummer. One of the more malevolent, or bitter, depending on which way you look at it, encounters Steve had with Paul McCartney was when Jimmy McCulloch actually rang up Holley and asked him to drum on his latest record, aka Jimmy McCulloch's first post-Wings release. I'm not sure if this was White Line or one of the 50 other bands Jimmy had started after Wings. And Steve, feeling unsure as to how Paul might take such an offer, went to some of the heads and suits at MPL, and just from this guy's reaction to Steve, you can see how small of a cog he is in this machine as Wings drummer, and how much sway Paul has by contrast. The guy simply said that Steve would be out of his mind to go with their offer, and that it should be never brought up again. And it never was. It has to be noted that at the time of joining the band, Juba and Holley were still in their early to mid-20s, and this wasn't the first time Paul's age had been called into question either. There's footage of Paul being interviewed during the Wings Over America tour, and they even asked him then if he was too old to still be doing this, which shows that even at this point in his career, what Paul is doing is still relatively new and shocking. It is shocking back in 1979 that someone would be performing in their 40s. How quaint. Imagine if they saw the Rolling Stones playing today. Oh my gosh, you see Mick Jagger throwing himself around stage. You hope he doesn't hurt himself. So, despite the fact that these two jobbing musicians were clearly more than happy to add this gig to their resumes so early in their careers, there was a certain lack of excitement from Paul for this new group. Several years later, McCartney confessed, "It was getting a bit boring, yeah, to tell the truth. I was getting a bit fed up with yet another lineup." And later on he also said, "Even though they were good musicians, my enthusiasm had peaked." And who could blame him? Wings had anywhere between 4 to 5 lineups by this point, again depending on your point of view, and that did have the effect of the band's membership being quite a transient and mercurial position. No one but Denny had stuck around for this whole time, and there was a decided lack of closeness and companionship and brotherhood within the band that meant McCartney didn't have as much of a reason to stay if he was getting bored. There's no tether keeping him down. Denny Lane is not his best friend John Lennon. If Paul wants to go, he can, and fuck them, they can do whatever they want. Make no mistake, folks, with this album, there's a definite sense, possibly more so than ever, that there is a certain regression within the band dynamic. Red Rose Speedway is normally hailed as the album where Paul had the greatest amount of control in the studio and over the band, but at this point, but in many ways this album is no different to that period. This is truly, the McCartneys with Lane and they're literal backing musicians at this point. There's no presupposed, if misguided notion that this is meant to be a band of equals. I mean, we won't actually be going into the nitty-gritty details of the breakup during this episode. We'll be covering all of that in our upcoming McCartney 2 episode, as the breakup does come after the Japan incident. Can't wait to talk about that. But even during the recording of this album, you can see that certain cracks were starting to form in other members of the band also. Linda, during one of the nights in the converted barn, confided in Holly about her true feelings towards the band, saying, "All I truly want is to be here with my family." And to make tensions worse, the other main creative force within the band was also starting to feel the strain of the studio band lifestyle. From day one, Denny Laine has wanted just to play live with Paul, and that was the gig that Denny Laine was sold when Paul first formed the band all those years ago. The whole reason for Wings in the first place was because Paul McCartney wanted to tour during the Let It Be sessions, and the other Beatles weren't interested. So to find out, as a fellow Brummie and Denny Laine fan, that Paul's been essentially dicking Denny around for nearly 10 years now, in more ways than one, is just upsetting, really, because it's not like there's no demand for a tour. It's just that Paul has bouts of indecision and bouts of boredom and then bouts of creativity that drag him in other directions and solo directions and other side projects and this and that, and he never just focuses on getting the band out there, getting their 10,000 hours done. Paul's not putting in the work in the way that he had to put in the work with the Beatles, rather than doing months in Hamburg. Oh, they'll just tour around England in the back of a van for a couple of weeks. Everything's so rushed and so optimistically unorganised. We haven't toured now since Wings Over America, and I'm sure that the gap between the Wings Over the World tour and the 1979 UK tour must have felt like decades to Denny. He says, "I'm desperate to get back on tour. I get twitchy sitting around in the studio. I'm quite sure we'll be touring soon. Otherwise, I honestly feel like I wouldn't be able to stay in Wings." Look, this Denny Laine situation is getting serious here now, people. Without him, there is no Wings. If he goes, then it just leaves the Paul McCartney band. And Denny has been... And I know that I've been saying, and I know I've just said Paul McCartney is exerting an extreme amount of control over this album, but Denny is the middleman. He's the go-between between Paul and other members of the band. He's the go-between between Paul and the production team, Paul needs this guy to act as his consigliere, to act as his confidant, or maybe lackey would be a better word, actually. Denny's been putting up with this shit for a while now, and you'd like to think that there would be a level of professionalism in the studio, but as Steve Holly clearly picks up on here, he details, "I suspect that Denny felt like he should have had more of a partnership than he actually had, and I think Paul was upset about Denny's own demeanour and the way he was carrying on. I also think there were personality differences between the two of them, and certainly between Denny's wife Jojo and Linda." I love how Holly's getting awfully candid about his short period of time in the band, but I guess when you're a successful musician both before and after Wings, you don't have too much to lose, I suppose. But it's not like he's like Denny Laine will do soon, like go to the tabloids or anything. He carries on here, it gets kind of meow catty here. "They were poles apart. Jojo was a high-spirited party girl and just loved the glitz and rock and roll lifestyle, and Linda was much more down to earth." In a way, Paul's growing resentment and boredom for the band was a move that was for the best. The group had been bogged down with interpersonal politics and the notion of not having enough input on the music for a while now. There had always been so-called money issues, even though this latest lineup of the band had apparently got the best financial deal of any lineup of Wings ever. Now that Paul had two young, eager and rather green musicians under his wing, no pun intended, neither of whom have much stake or say-so within the band dynamic, meant that Paul, like I say, can just crack on and tell people what to do and make beautiful music from it. But this doesn't mean I still don't feel buckets and buckets of sorrow for Juba and Holly, who probably thought that they'd hit the jackpot and the adventure of a lifetime that they were obviously so excited for was then tragically cut short by issues we'll be discussing in the next podcast. But spoiler alert, history will once again repeat itself and we will have issues with Paul, Weed and the Land of the Rising Sun. But anyway, let's get back to the album before this podcast turns into a gossip column in Melody Maker magazine. A new sound for a new band. Now, I know we haven't got to the review part of this episode yet, you'll have to sit tight for that. But that is because, more so than any other Wings release at this point, we really have to build up quite a bit of context to explain the rather dramatic shift in McCartney / the band's sound for this album.
You'd think the fact that Mull of Kintyre was being the biggest number one the UK had ever had in recorded history at that point would have been confirmation that Paul McCartney is more than comfortable doing his own thing, doing whatever he feels like doing and exploring the genres of music that interest him. I mean, what more validation don't you need to change what you're doing than the biggest number one in the history of the country? Yet, for some reason, the gods, the cosmos, decided that it would be best if Wings eschewed its usual jack-of-all-trades, dash of this, dash of that, something for everyone ethos, in place of moving with the times, which sounds like the plot of a terrible, Wings 4 movie. Like I said, Mull of Kintyre was massive, absolutely massive, but it was a bit of an anomaly in the charts, the exception that proves the rule perhaps. But there was a feeling that Wings was starting to slip into irrelevance somewhat, and that the majority of the people buying his records were now part of the previous generation of music record buyers, rather than the current one. These new youngsters were worshipping new false rock gods like punk, which was essentially a deconstruction and disassembly of the old rock deities that came before them by going, more primal, and new wave, which was almost the anti-response to punk, which was much more melodic and quote-unquote artsy-fartsy. But either way, the little nippers were not exactly flocking out in the numbers that they once did. Unless you were Andre Homan and you buy Back to the Egg on release, you probably don't even know this album is coming out or even exists, really. But Andre was another exception that proved the rule. But more on him later, of course. With the fear that he may no longer be as relevant as he once was, Paul decided that he would take it upon himself and the band to absorb and incorporate new elements of this new music into their existing sound to jazz up the album. Paul said, "The new wave thing was happening and I sort of realised, well, what's so wrong with doing an up-tempo album? Back to the Egg was influenced just as what I'd wanted to do at the time. The direction I felt I hadn't been in for a while." One of the main benefits of this newer style, as it were, quote-unquote again, and it's something that quickly dawns on you as you listen to the album, is that it allows Wings to tap into their rock roots, which, as McCartney details here in an interview sometime after the release of London Town, says, "We didn't seem to be writing any real hard rockers. Next time, we'll go for a bit more sweat." When asked about this new direction, new guitarist Lawrence Juba said, "It was really quite exciting because the harder rock aspect of things gelled very quickly. There was a certain rawness that was going on. Punk was in the air. Paul's kids had been listening to a lot of that kind of stuff, so it was kind of in his ears." Now, Paul's first dabbling in punk at the behest of his children was the very, very poorly rendered punk song Boil Crisis, which I'll be getting into on one of my hot hits and cold cuts episodes, no doubt. I think that'll be part 3. Yeah, that'll be on part 3. With a title like Back to the Egg, you think that the band might be trying to convey that they are really going back to square one. Forget about going back to the drawing board, we're going back to the egg. However, for a band to truly go back to their roots, wouldn't they have to, go back and make a much more folkier album? That's what Wings going back to their roots really would be, if you think about it. This is a band going back to their roots in the sense that, in the pretense that they were a real rock band to begin with. And remember, folks, Wings are a pop band first, in sheep's clothing, not a rock band. So this should be fun either way it turns out. Now, to execute this new sound, Paul would do something that he rarely ever has the chance to do: admit that he isn't able to do something. Paul can't produce a punk and new wave album, so McCartney drafted in one of his old Beatles buddies from the White Album to sit in as co-producer for the album. This young chap's name was Chris Thomas, and he entered this story in 1968, where George Martin, presumably rather tired and pissed off with the Fab Four acting like a bunch of cunts, decided to jet off on a holiday and left this little newbie to handle all of the sessions, with Thomas producing Birthday and Happiness is a Warm Gun, and he plays the keyboards on 4 songs: Mellotron on The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, piano on Long 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 and Savoy Truffle, and harpsichord on Piggies. But this familiarity was not the only reason Paul wanted to get Thomas on board. No, Chris Thomas had just so happened to be the producer of possibly the most iconic and influential punk album of all time, in the UK at least. That record, which in some circles is still reverberating through the zeitgeist to this day, weirdly, is the Sex Pistols' debut collection of noise, titled Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. Now, I know that in the UK, the punk scene barely escaped these shores in the way that it kind of existed here, but it was a huge game changer for rock and roll, and it really shook things up, and it proved that some people with some anger, some guitars, and a studio could make an album of pure charged aggression, which seemed to really tap into this disillusioned post-baby boomer, post-hippie, post-summer of love generation. The old rock and roll hits weren't going to cut it anymore. The disco venturings were a little bit, a little too little too late, I suppose. Paul was still trailing behind as a rock presence, not being constant enough, not being consistent enough, still doing too many piano ballads, still being too Paul McCartney in a sense, maybe. So the idea of them changing up this sound for this record, again, it's one of those things. A lot of Back to the Egg makes sense on paper, and a lot of it does work out more or less in the end. But more so than any release, the moment I read this, the moment I knew that Paul was going to do punk, I could not help but feel that it just stinks of a guy who is unsure of himself. He doesn't know what to do with Wings at this point. He doesn't really know what direction to push them in. Maybe his own directions, things that are going to appear on Tug of War and Pipes of Peace, and definitely McCartney 2, are more interesting to him. Maybe he doesn't want to waste those kind of creative juices on Wings at this point. So maybe he's like, well, let's just see what other directions we can take the band, and maybe just, we'll pick punk and we'll pick new wave, and we'll see what Wings comes out with at this point. And in the case of Getting Closer, drag out a song that he'd written even a few years ago just to fill it up. So I guess it's all just one big experiment on McCartney's part, because he knows Wings' days are more numbered than anyone else in the band truly knows. So I guess he's got very little to lose with this creativity, and maybe that creates a certain amount of freedom for him, I don't know. I guess we'll have to listen to the album again and see if any of that translates through. The Loss of Jimmy. These albums never seem to go smoothly. As we move along through these episodes, we do seem to be reminded every now and then that, folks, these are real human beings that we're talking about here. People who lived and died. Recently, we lost Henry McCulloch. Paul lost Linda in '98. And whilst Paul and the band were recording Back to the Egg, whilst Paul was presumably trying to forget that Jimmy McCulloch tried to borrow his drummer, Steve Holley, for one of his own songs earlier in the year, and Paul received another one of those phone calls. Jimmy McCulloch was only 26 when he was pronounced dead on the 27th of September 1979. He had only been out of the band 2 years and 19 days. The story goes that he was pretty much blowing through his post-Wings royalties rather quickly and living a very hard, very fast lifestyle. That just sounds like Jimmy McCulloch to me. He formed about 19 new bands in this time and recorded about -3 songs with all of them. Then, after a few days of no contact, his brother, after detecting a rather suspicious odour emanating from Jimmy's flat, kicked the door in, only to find Jimmy slumped in his chair, cigarette in hand. Obviously, this was a big loss, not just to Wings fans, but to rock in general, as there is this painfully obvious aura to anyone who listened to the variety of his works. They can just pick up on that. This aura that this kid is great, he's talented, he just needs to quit the fast lifestyle and focus his talents, and he's going to make something fantastic. Jimmy certainly never achieved his own full potential, and certainly not in such a controlling environment as Wings. Though in his own compositions, with an outside writing partner no less, which is a real weird oddity in the history of Wings, Jimmy showed a great deal of guitar writing talent. He was a fresh sound for the band. He had a powerful stage presence and, in all fairness, a very competent singing voice. He was a breath of fresh air, really, and admittedly, along with many other elements with the band at this period, helped catapult Wings to their peak in both the charts and people's minds. He is part of the iconic Wings Over America lineup, He is Jimmy in the band, and nothing's ever going to change that. Some people may be upset to find out that Paul chose not to go to the funeral, but come on now, folks, this is hardly out of the blue behaviour for Paul, the man who only a few episodes ago didn't even go to his own father's funeral, let's not forget. So what chance do you think that Jimmy Troublemaker McCulloch would have? No one else from the band decided to go either, though. Joe English was back in the States, and Linda is hardly going to go without Paul. Oddly enough, though, Denny Laine was still harbouring his own gripes with Jimmy as well, as he freely admitted in this interview. I was kind of pissed off with Jimmy over a lot of things, and I'd kind of fallen out with him. I know it sounds kind of funny to say, but when somebody dies, you can still be angry with them. In the end, he was just too dangerous for his own good. Too dangerous indeed. We've already touched on the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of Jimmy McCulloch a few times on this show. In fact, the reason I got Paul Sally on the show for Wings Over America was partly due to the fact that I was parroting some info that I'd heard before, whereby there was supposedly this shady backstreet doctor who'd been prescribing Jimmy McCulloch with painkillers, apparently for a bad back he'd got from a jet ski accident. Paul basically explains it here. Paul, could you elaborate on this Jimmy McCulloch rumour, the thing that kind of sparked all of this? You must be able to shed some light on where that started.
Well, it started in the infamous Paul McCartney biography, Blackbird, by Jeffrey Giuliano, who fancies himself as sort of a Beatles expert, but in reality he's nothing more than a tabloid author who makes up stories for his books. So apparently this story came from Denny Lane, but Denny has denied that it ever happened. So who knows what the author was thinking when he wrote it. And then if you read that book and you read that part, it just sounds like a badly written fan fiction, because like he goes into things like Jimmy's mindset and things that Jimmy allegedly said, and it's really unbelievable. So honestly, I don't even know why people believe it in the first place. But
now, whilst I trust Paul here immensely, I am in fact still waiting for my copy of Blackbird to arrive, and I can't wait to pick it apart. But even in Tom Doyle's Man on the Run, the book which Paul Sally himself was a contributor on, even makes note of some of the peculiarities with the crime scene, shall we say. It reads, "There was some evidence that someone had been in with him and absconded, likely scared. Cannabis, morphine and alcohol were found in the guitarist's blood, but other than the joint roach, no drugs were in the flat. The police concluded the place had been tidied in a hurry. The door's chain had been broken by someone else other than Jimmy's brother Jack." Now that little passage there is full of little interesting nuggets really there, isn't it? Firstly, this is the account of the events from a guy being advised by Paul Sally, a man who thinks this whole story is 100% bollocks anyway. So for Tom Doyle to come out with this rather inquisitive statement against a final inquiry speaks volumes. There's morphine in Jimmy's system. Is this proof of the doctor? They're trying to fix Jimmy's back pain because there were no drugs found in the apartment. The doctor maybe took them with him. They were his drugs, after all. Very odd. A doctor would know how to clean up that kind of environment. Maybe the scared friend theory is the most likely one. Jimmy ODs, they grab all the drugs, they do a quick wipe down in a panic, and they get the hell out of there. But if that's the case, then why was the door forcibly opened from the outside? Was there a cleanup team sent to get rid of dirty Hollywood evidence? Perhaps someone panicked and then someone was sent round to get rid of evidence. Did a passerby break into the house and find the two people overdosing, took that person and left Jimmy? See, none of it adds up and it all stinks to high heaven of some bullshit. Though we do have to consider the main reason why this was never chased up. And whilst this is certainly the most morbid reason, it is by far the least fantastical or theatrical. The reason this wasn't seen as all too suspicious is because the idea of it happening was of no shock to anybody. None of this was chased up because no one was surprised that young Jimmy McCulloch overdosed on drugs. Whether someone took the drugs or not, whether they were his drugs or not, no one is shocked that young Jimmy McCulloch would have overdosed on some hard drugs. It did happen. It seems like in many quotes it was just a matter of time before something like that happened. Maybe the saga of Jimmy McCulloch needs to be best served in a bonus episode or a blog post, as his antics have been broken up somewhat by the episode-to-episode format over these albums, so it's hard to picture him as a real guy, rather than just some dangerous guitarist of Wings. Though, on that note, I will be awaiting the release of Paul Sally's own book on Jimmy McCulloch, Paul Sally himself being the Jimmy McCulloch fan on YouTube, who we had on for our Wings Over America album. And it seems like he'll be making the very first book, the very first untold story, fully told, of Jimmy McCulloch. So I'll be looking forward to buying that and then mining it for a bonus episode or two, who knows.
The 1979 UK tour. Before we begin, yes, this tour did take place after the album was recorded and released, but I always like to have the recording of the album part after all of the context, and I know it contains a song
written during the McCartney 2 sessions, but we already have far too much to talk about on our McCartney 2 episode anyway. It would have been appropriate to bring up then. I even think in my first draft of my McCartney 2 notes, the 79 tour appeared in there. But like I say, that episode is chock-a-block, so we're going to pop it into this one instead. So there. We've been through quite a few tours with Wings over the last few episodes. Probably not as many tours as either I or Denny Lane would have liked, but hey, Paul is easily distracted, so we will take what we can get. We had the university tour, which was meant to simulate and condense the Beatles' 10,000 German practice hours into a couple of backroom gigs. The UK tour, which was shite. The European tour, which was slightly less shite. And, well, I'm just going to get this one out of the way right now, folks, because unfortunately this tour had to follow on from, of course, Wings Over America. Go back and check out our episode on that. I know it's wrong to compare Wings' 1979 tour across the UK with that of Wings Over the World, Wings Over America, as basically every single element surrounding each tour is a completely different beast altogether. I mean, you can almost define this 79 UK tour by everything that it's not, by comparison with Wings Over America. There's the hype, and let's face it, folks, there was much more clamour for this band to tour with after the double hitter of Band on the Run and Venus and Mars, whereas now we have the buzz of London Town and Back to the Egg. Yeah, whilst this might excite me and you, you know, the podcast listener, the public at the time, the wider audience, would not be as incensed to pack those seats to see the recent songs of this iteration of the band. And then there's the scale. The scale was incredibly reduced. It was pulled back. This is no longer a world tour. This is just one small country. It's got a smaller budget. It's a much more modest tour with a mix of larger and smaller venues and a varying pedigree, really. I mean, when you compare the Birmingham Odeum to the Inglewood Forum or Chicago Stadium or Boston Gardens, you know, you're hardly going to be getting the same volume of screams, are you? And I doubt the back room is as nice. I mean, this following quote from McCartney pretty much sums it all up, really. I mean, even he hardly sounds all too excited, so why the fuck should we? At the moment, we don't really want a great big tour all over the world, with everything that entails. So, it just looks as though we'll just be turning up with our guitars and plugging them in wherever they'll want to listen to us. And, you know, you could say that perhaps, you know, Paul doesn't want to do a grand tour, he doesn't want to commit to anything too strongly, perhaps he just wants to be at home with the family, definitely we know Linda does, and perhaps he just doesn't want to put too much into a band that he ultimately knows he isn't going to be doing anything with. Maybe he already knows that Japan's coming up and he's already packed his marijuana ready to be caught. Who knows how many days Wings have left in Paul McCartney's eyes at this point, but he's definitely not excited to take on something major with this band. The same can be said for the rehearsal time. McCartney himself later admitted that the band were not fully up to scratch, and you can tell. The Wings Over America lineup had been playing together for 2 albums now, had some great rehearsal time that you can hear at Elstree Studios. Many times over, rehearsal time that Juba and Holly eventually had to learn the material, and when you listen to the shows across the 79 tour, there are constant fuck-ups, lacks in synchronicity, and a general poor amount of showmanship compared to the kind of nun's cunt tightness of Wings Over America. Yeah, I am going to trigger one of you today, folks. The set list is also completely mismatched as well. Wings Over America firstly had just these solid hits. You have Band on the Run, as well as the new album's big hit. You've got Silly Love Songs, They Bring In My Love, and most importantly, there's this titanium framework of this made-for-concert numbers from Venus and Mars. And it's exactly what that kind of show needed. And there isn't really a presupposed idea here. With the Wings Over America set list, Paul McCartney had been kind of cultivating these songs over several albums for many, many years now, and this is so much more of a slapdash, let's just promote the new album and chuck in a few hits kind of deal. I'll be getting onto later why I feel McCartney was choosing a lot of his solo material and Beatles stuff in these set lists as well, but I digress. With this 1979 Back to the Egg tour, we have a bunch of songs that aren't even sure what album they're supposed to belong to, let alone what tour. So I'm just going to read you out the set list now and just trying to imagine if this set list would kind of excite you. There are many elements that would excite me, actually, but there just seems to be something a little off, shall we say. So starting off, we have Got to Get You Into My Life, which is from Revolver, followed on by Getting Closer. Then Every Night from McCartney 1, Again and Again and Again. I've Had Enough from London Town, which is a nice inclusion actually. We have Denny Lane's No Words from Band on the Run. Linda actually does a song on this tour, which some people may point out to be the biggest flaw of the, which some people may even point out to be the biggest flaw of the tour in itself. But some renditions, some live versions of Cook of the House, especially the Last Flight in Glasgow, aren't that bad actually. So you have Cook of the House, then Old Siam Sir, then Paul brings in Maybe I'm Amazed because he just has to, also from McCartney 1. Then we go all the way back. Yes, we have The Fool on the Hill from the Magical Mystery Tour. Then from Let It Be we have Let It Be. Then for some reason we have Hot as Sun, but no glasses from McCartney 1 again. One of the. Then Spin It On, 20 Flight Rock, which is a cover of a Eddie Cochran song. Go Now, Denny Lane song again from the Moody Blues days. Arrow Through Me. Then Paul's solo Wonderful Christmas Time, though this was not performed for the December 29th Hammersmith Odeon show. Obviously that was the only show that took place after Christmas. I understand why they didn't do that. Then you have Coming Up, Good Night Tonight, Yesterday from Help, Mull of Kintyre, and we round things off with Band on the Run. It's not the worst set list I've ever seen, but it's overly reliant on some of the worst parts of Back to the Egg, in my opinion. I'll give my opinions on Getting Closer and again and again and again later. It would have been nice to have To You on here perhaps, or So Glad to See You here. Arrow Through Me was one that was never particularly done well, which is unfortunate. And the worst part about all of this, people, is that, you know, and you can hear this on any of the shows on the Jimmy McCulloch fan channel, that the whole thing is just inches away from being a complete shambles. Like, the last time you saw Wings was during Wings Over the World. Conceivably, you could be forgiven for assuming that you were seeing a completely different band. With all of that bombastic energy gone, like it had almost never existed before. They've almost regressed to the worst elements of the Wings University tour in '72, and like some of these spots are just plain embarrassing. Though it does make you wonder, does Paul want to quit because they aren't playing well, or aren't they playing well because Paul wants to quit? It's just a confusing mess. Another person who would notice a certain difference in the band, someone who had been with Wings in the background for quite a few years now, the indomitable Band on the Run, defining Howie Casey, the Wings brass arranger for the live tours. He'd spotted that the band were becoming less of a aspirational rock band that they were in the Wings Over America days, where they were kind of chasing this dream of being this big rock band, of having something to prove. And now that they've proved themselves, once again they're becoming flabby, they're becoming a bit tiresome, and effectively had started to become a show band. He also had this illuminating little comment on the affair. He said, "They all gave us black suits and it almost became formal." And there is something to that. There aren't as many get up and jive songs here. Paul's definitely aging. He's allowing songs like The Fool on the Hill and Maybe I'm Amazed and Let It Be and Hot as Sun to all go together in one run. And yeah, we had the acoustic set on Wings Over America, and that slowed things down, but there was still this energy to it, and you can tell that this set list, if you took out the Back to the Egg stuff, is definitely starting to look like a solo Paul McCartney venture here now, people. Whether it's conscious or not, Paul is just pulling the band away here now, and whilst he's doing it, he's living up to his contractual obligations to promote Back to the Egg. He's doing that very well, but he could have picked some better songs, definitely. There's this awfully depressing quote from Steve Holley, where he's talking about where Paul McCartney would come off stage like some sort of heroin addict who had been given methadone and just couldn't get that same fix again. I have the quote here. He said, "I remember a show I enjoyed for whatever reason, and bouncing into the dressing room and saying something like, 'Great show, great show.' And his reaction was, 'Yeah, it was okay.' As I left the room, I thought, of course it was just okay. I mean, look at some of the places he's been. Look at some of the concert and experiences he had. That was one of the first times it dawned on me. Is there any way to top what playing a concert with the Beatles must have been like? And I can't imagine there was. It was almost like that was omnipresent." Now, the shadow of the Beatles should really be only something that's affecting Paul in the group, so if it's affecting the wider band, then you can see why they're not really functioning as this unit now, because they know that Paul's loyalties and desires are not to be with them really. They know that they are the second option, they are the second best option, they are the rebound band, as it were.
maybe the earlier incarnations when Paul had a bit more enthusiasm for the project, a bit more enthusiasm for the idea, maybe they felt a bit more like a band. But, you know, Steve, Holly and Lawrence Juba were recruited like session musicians, and now they're pretty much being treated like session musicians, and there's just not this connection. I remember there was this quote where Paul and Linda were really starting to show their age, whereby even, you know, Denny would still like stay out after the show and stuff with Lawrence and Holly, but Paul and Linda would just get a car back to whatever house or flat or hotel they were at every night. They'd just go straight after the show. There'd be no partying, and no wonder the band didn't feel like they were connecting with Paul at all. But then again, Denny Lane said he's had more joints with Paul than he's ever had with anyone in his entire life and feels no closer to him as a result. So I'm not sure what odds Juba and Holly really had to begin with. However, on the flip side of all of these downer points, it does seem that, and I'm taking this based on the testimonies of a couple of books and two lovely chaps who went to two separate gigs in the same 79 tour, and one of the unifying points, rather like Wings Over the World, Wings Over America, is that the band, by proxy of doing all of these shows poorly, a lot, got better each time, and so by the time we get to Glasgow, the set is much sharper. In fact, the last flight to Scotland was easily the best gig in the tour. However, this wouldn't stop McCartney from experimenting with his band for future use. This was actually the concert where Wings actually yielded their last hit single. Knowing the end was nigh, McCartney continued to treat his band like these soon-to-be disposable assets that they were, and had them test the waters for the lead single from McCartney 2. Wait, the lead single from McCartney 2 is also Wings' last single? Yes, there would be two versions of the song that would be coming up. Now, whilst I and my guest will be getting into the specifics of these two versions, why one of them is utter shite and one of them is brilliant, later on in the next episode, McCartney 2, what I will say is that in terms of radio airplay and overall popularity, it was actually the band version that had the last laugh, as it was but this hard rock Wings version from the last flight in Scotland would be the one that would strike a chord in the States and sell massively over there, ultimately beating out the kind of dance rock number from the solo Macca album. At this point in history, it's clear to me that McCartney is already getting Wings to plug his imminent solo career. He knows he could go solo at any moment. Maybe he's not thinking of going live at all, but it's also odd that one of the best songs to ever grace the Wings 1979 tour would be Every Night from his solo debut album, McCartney, or McCartney 1 as it's known here on the show. And whilst it's a song that is heavily reworked for the Wings group rock sound, what it does do, without your brain noticing, is remind you that McCartney is a solo entity, and that is indeed a thing. And to add insult to injury, he even got the band to perform the very recent solo McCartney Christmas track, Wonderful Christmas Time, which they were also forced to do the video for as well. I think if we have to pick a moment where Wings were literally just a bunch of interns acting as a front for solo McCartney, this would be it. Juba and Holly haven't even been in the band for 5 minutes, and they're already plugging stuff that they literally have no involvement in. Ironically, my assessment of McCartney was exactly the opposite of what Rolling Stone critic Mick Brown, who in fact was equally as disappointed in these shows as I, but he had it the other way around. He said, "Everything seemed to be designed to take the spotlight off of Paul and spread it amongst the rest of Wings. The impression given was not of a deity with a box of thunderbolts, but a band on the stage for the hell of it." Now, I find his analysis interesting because it's the exact opposite interpretation with the same exact evidence given, and there's nothing about his analysis that I can really say is wrong. I'm just some guy in a bedroom, remember? And, of course, I cannot help but agree with him on his last point. They really were on stage for the hell of it. At least McCartney was. And whether you're like me and you think that the final tour was to put a spotlight on him, or whether it was about spreading the blame of how bad Wings were at this point, you can't help but feel really, really, really sad for this band. These are some painful death throes that are basically begging out, calling out for a coup d'etat to put them out of their misery at this point. The tour finally officially came to a spiritual close with Wings' last hurrah swan song performance, the charity fundraiser, the concert for Kampuchea, the concert for Cambodia, and this would be the final gig Wings would ever play. For more details on this show, go back and download our Concert for Kampuchea gig review bonus episode. I believe that was the first one we ever did, actually. Go and check that out. Recording the album. One of the best parts about doing a Paul McCartney podcast is that he likes to keep the audience interested in each recording by spicing things up in some way. He's like a very dutiful husband in a marriage where the sex life is starting to get a little bit stale, and I appreciate him for that. Sometimes he does it on a boat, sometimes he does it in Lagos or America, or as we'll see today, we will see him do it in both a castle and a barn, and he's keeping the band's passion truly alive. But honestly, if the press release for every single album was just Paul went to EMI Studios and bashed the album out in 2 weeks without incident, then this segment of the show would be shortened by 99% quicker than you could say Single Pigeon. So in terms of actually giving me something to talk about, I can only commend a dear Macca. For he is ever one to keep the band on their toes, and he is ever as excitable about the possibilities that a new locale can invite and inspire. Paul made sure the band was always on the move. Session 1. The first time the band got together to seriously start working on some new songs was between the 29th and 27th of June-July in 1978 at a makeshift studio in McCartney's farm. This do-it-yourself studio, very much in the spirit of Wing's Lagos setup, was named the Spirit of Ranashan Studios and was up north in Campbelltown, Scotland. Unlike the more jaded and cynical past members of the band, the younglings, Juba and Holly, were still relatively green, with Holly noting, "I didn't really know how anything worked in the music business at that level, so for me it was a complete surprise." Juba, who was the slightly more worldly of the two, had this to say about their digs instead. There were some creature comforts there, but nonetheless, it was a converted barn, and that's where they would live. And in this converted barn, the band managed to get their first set of songs locked down for the album, including a few cold cuts and hot hits type tracks that I'll be discussing on a later bonus episode. These songs were Arrow Through Me, Again and Again and Again, To You, Old Siam Sir, Winter Rose, Spin It On, Cage, Weep for Love, Maisie, and Ranashan Rock. This was clearly the most experimental and most exploratory phase of the recordings, as the types of songs here are just all over the place in terms of genre and tone, and the last 3 songs I mentioned didn't even make it onto the album, so clearly they hadn't even landed on a final direction or concept for the album at this point. Session 2. For the second lot of sessions, I think Paul wanted to create quite a casual atmosphere, so he thought he'd slum it in the most nondescript, casual location possible. Oh wait, no he didn't. He took them all to a fucking medieval fortress instead, a place known as Limpine Castle, Kent, and they worked their way through September 11th to the 29th in 78. When speaking about this odd locale, Paul said, "We recorded most of it in a medieval castle in Kent. For the whole month we took over this fortress and proceeded to record in the kitchen, the stairwell, the spiral staircase and the music hall. What's more, the owner found herself narrating a story called The Poodle and the Pug on a special track. It was good, it was interesting. We like to record it in unusual places because it gives the recordings a healthier and brighter approach. I personally don't believe in acoustic myths. I think that as long as you have good mics and good songs, you can record anywhere." The second set of songs recorded in the Limpine Castle were Reception, We're Open Tonight, After the Ball, Million Miles, Love Awake, and The Broadcast. These sessions can essentially be boiled down to either the concert or the wussy sessions, whereby the majority of the softer ballads and the love songs and the more experimental radio kind of concepty type songs were recorded. And it makes sense, as this classically romantic setting made for the perfect spark of inspiration. Paul clearly still knows what he's talking about in terms of finding new locations. However, there is a real lack of punk and new wave inside of these castles' walls, and this breaking of the flow is kind of what leads the album to be as unfocused as it untimely is. Maybe they just couldn't get the amps through the portcullis, who knows. Session 3. The third sessions took place between October and December 1978, and for these sessions Paul would return to his second home, EMI's Abbey Road Studios in London. It was here, and only here, Paul would be able to gather the Rockestra band together. The third set of songs recorded for the album were Rockestra Theme, and So Glad to See You Here, with the Rockestra band as well, Getting Closer, Baby's Request, and some more work on Arrow Through Me and Old Siam Sir. It was during this time that the length of production and cost of the sessions was starting to become rather noticeable. For example, Kate Bush, the new darling of pop, was now so big that she ended up taking up the majority of space in EMI, and this is space that would normally be reserved for McCartney. So, no expense spared, rather than making a new studio like a sane person, or just recording somewhere else like a frugal person, he decides, to have an exact recreation of EMI's Abbey Road Studios in his own basement, like some sort of George Martin version of Joseph Fritzl. This would allow him to, carry on editing the album without having to feel like he's doing anything different, I guess. Paul must believe in some meta-natural magical power that exists only within Abbey Road, and any attempt to recreate that feeling in the studio must always be a good thing. Session 4. Then, after a short break, we come back into the new year with the 4th sessions. These took place between March and April of '79, once again at Abbey Road Studios. Presumably Kate Bush had fucked off by this point, but it makes you wonder why they didn't just stay in Paul's sex dungeon studio. These sessions were mostly just overdub scoring and mixing, and this is where, more likely than not, where the so-called Back to the Egg medley that we'll get onto later was finally put together. The album was eventually finished and released on June 8th and June 11th in the UK and US respectively. Sadly, despite the success of Goodnight Tonight and the Back to the Egg TV special and wide promotion that the album received, it didn't manage to have the staying power of previous Wings releases. It lasted only 8 weeks in the UK, peaking at number 4, woohoo, pewter place, and did even worse in the States, only managing to scrape the number 8 spot. Not only 2 albums on, and the spirit of success behind the string of Wings number 1 hits, ending with Wings Over America, had truly worn off, and it was clear that the audience were beginning to tire of this band in a worryingly noticeable fashion. A concept album? This next little section of the show is something we've discussed a few times when we've brought up this album, and the idea of a concept is obviously one that is no stranger to McCartney, and it's one that he will dabble in to keep himself from getting bored and or giving him a new challenge. Though what we've also learned is that even his most successful concept albums, aka Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, can still feature this tendency from him not to stick to the script and get distracted in that typical Macca manner. This means you're never really going to get that Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds type thoroughbred concept album. McCartney as a man just can't stay still that long. Though you can argue that Band on the Run is the Paul McCartney concept album, but he also made it by accident. Now, the one thing I will say about all these concepts is that, and I'm saying concepts with big quotation marks with my fingers there, is that they may not be as concrete as, say, something like Sgt. Pepper, but they're not as wishy-washy as something like the supposed Wings at the Speed of Sound concept either. I mean, nothing was published officially on any of the album supplementary material to acknowledge any of these following concepts, what they are or how they are in any way important to enjoying the album. So I'm not going to think of them as particularly important for my listening experience, but they do make for interesting reinterpretations on multiple visits. So these are instead more like a different lens in which you can view the album, a different interpretation. The first kind of semi-existent at worst or loose at best concept/theme of the album is that this whole some sort of meta-narrative whereby the band are on a journey, and to get to a gig they will have to go back to the egg, as Paul describes here. It started off as being a concept album. It had a travelling idea where somebody got into their van on a rainy night and was heading towards the gig, but it just ended up being just songs. So I think it's clear that this concept was abandoned pretty quickly, as there is no indication once you listen to this album that there's any notion of a band travelling or trying to get somewhere. And then there's the second, possibly more enacted of the supposed concepts for the album, whereby the whole experience is supposed to be like you tuning into a modern radio station and you flick through the different channels and you get a wide variety of stuff, and it's all very non sequitur. Perhaps this is the radio inside the van that's getting to the gig, who knows? But at least this radio concept is actually expressed throughout the music in some way. We have the reception and the broadcast, which are both alluding to radios both by name and by their content. With both we have these adoptions of collage radio broadcast like environments, with crackling and interference, and whilst it doesn't go throughout the whole album, you could at least at a stretch commit to this one. But then on top of all of this, you've got the We're Open Tonight song, which at some point was meant to be part of a quasi-concept intro to the album. We're open tonight, and then obviously this would kind of follow on to be a concept whereby, the band are like friendly shopkeepers or something, or maybe they are the venue, like this is the venue, it's open tonight and the show is about to start. But again, this is now the third song on the album for some reason, which is a clear indication that the concept has now been completely abandoned and it is just a song in its own right. All I can tell you is that there's clearly a lack of a Pepper-esque idea to kick things off. As you can tell, that a lot of these separate songs seem to have been created for different concept albums, and then it's all passed off as like it was meant to be this way the whole time. It's meant to be one collection of songs, which is really not. And this is already concerning because we've already established that the band haven't set on a final sound or theme, and now we're not even sure of what kind of songs we're aiming at or trying to write in the first place, or whether we're trying to fit a theme or not. Christ, no longer the production took 4 sessions and took so long and had this annoying stop-start feel, because it did have 4 sessions, it did take forever, and had an annoying stop-start feeling. Now, fortunately for Back to the Egg, as we'll shortly see, most of this ends up having little to no bearing on the final product, as it was always going to be a bit of a wild card either way. And in the end, the album feels much more cohesive than it ultimately deserves. Barely. The album cover. Once again, we return to the discussion of the album cover part of our show. Once again, I've actually remembered to do it, so go Team Paul or nothing. And I must admit, rather like the album itself, it has taken a while for my initial sour feelings for this cover to dissipate. Now, I'm not saying I love this cover or anything, but it's okay. I don't hate it nearly as much as I did, so that is an improvement. The cover itself is an odd blend, a composite of McCartney and the gang opening a hatch in their lounge floor, only to reveal that in a rather kind of Men in Black ending type way. It's a portal to view the Earth above space, almost like their house has been catapulted into the stratosphere. It's quite an eye-catching concept. It's not executed perfectly. There's a lot of negative space, and more could be done with what's being provided. I mean, most of it's quite dull and uninteresting to look at, with only a couple of highlights. And the band could be better presented as well, in my opinion. Like, the whole thing's just kind of dim and bland, and overall it just feels like there's a lack of flair, and what they should be trying to advertise is completely the opposite. Like, this is not a cover that is meant to be resonating with the youth at all, I feel. Though what I will say is that I'm glad to see that the whole band is on the cover as a single unit. I mean, even through their entire tenure, Jimmy McCulloch and Joe English never actually got on the front cover. So it's nice. So it is quite cool to see Paul, in spirit at least, allowing this new lineup to stand out from the previous ones. The album cover itself could even be part of a little concept album fantasy. I had this when I was making my notes, but the signal sound at the start of a reception almost has a sci-fi ring to it, and you can almost imagine the band trying to send a transmission back to Earth from space. Maybe they, in a rather Foo Fighters way, recorded this album in space, and this is their transmission, their broadcast. You can almost picture that, but we're not going to, as this album already has far too many failed concepts for my liking. We don't need any more. And for this triumphant return, McCartney took the band's album cover once again to the normally reliable album artwork extraordinaires / terrible businessmen Hipgnosis, who once again were already duped by Paul with their pay us what you think the album cover's worth payment policy. Honestly though, out of what I've seen from Hipgnosis, it seems like that Paul got the dullest overall of their entire 70s output, but maybe that's just down to Paul's poor choice of album covers himself. One thing that is a nice little Easter egg though for Wings fans, for those of you who know what they're looking for, Hipgnosis recently actually also been commissioned to do the front cover for the Wings' greatest compilation album, and the shot on the front cover of that album is a statue of Semiramis, a figure of ancient Assyrian legend, and that very statue on the front cover of that album is actually adorning the mantelpiece in the background of the Back to the Egg shoot, just behind the band. Not sure why it's there, not sure if it has any significance, but it's cool. The back cover also has these kooky little behind-the-scenes snapshots of the band that are taken none other by Linda, as per usual, and honestly I prefer this back section as it has a lot more vibrancy and energy going on, and it just seems like a much more fun environment to be a part of. The photos convey a genuine sense of joy and rebirth for the band's image, and dare I say it, actually kind of make them look cool, even if Steve Holly's doing the cool kid smoking a cigarette to impress the big boys thing. Yeah, overall a rather nondescript package with little staying power amongst the giants like Band on the Run and Ram, but again, it's nice that Steve and Lawrence got to be on the front cover, and perhaps the image of the band leaving Earth forever is a fitting final image to leave us all with. Critical reception. Rather famously, this is an album that, up until very recently indeed, was part of the Macca discography that he would routinely distance himself from and wasn't all too proud of at all, as we can quite clearly hear from this quote. "That wasn't one of our better albums. We came into it thinking it was going to be a good one. I mean, when you've done like 15 albums since the Beatles, they can't all be good. I defy anyone. Who is there where every single album's a cracker? I can't think of anyone. The Stones had some duff albums occasionally. Elvis certainly had some dud albums. Some of the people I like best. You just can't do it right all the time." And to me, this is an awfully exaggerated version of what really went down with Back to the Egg. And the album's perceived poor sales probably has something to do with his perception that this album wasn't exactly a hit, even so far as to jokingly refer to it as more of a bombcept album than a concept album. But as the years have gone on, rather like Ram, Paul has taken note of the second wave cult fandom that has grown around the album since its release, and because of that he is less harsh on his Final Wings endeavour. He says here, "I saw a thing on the telly the other night. It said there were about 3 million copies of Back to the Egg still sat around in a warehouse, which sounds like as if it was the world's greatest flop. For any other group to sell 1 million, which the album has, it would be a major success. It's a good album, and it's the band's first album." Now, we know all too well on this podcast Paul's opinion on what's going to be a success and what's not is one of the worst ways to gauge whether an album is going to be a hit or not, because conversely, we all know that critics can and do regularly have very little to no impact on the sales of albums anyway. So basically, we are looking out for these rare moments of critics and audiences agreeing on what is good and bad. So let's see what some of the public user reviews on ratethatalbum.com had to say about this album. User ISO4YL says, "This album is a less realised version of the side 2 of Red Rose Speedway. Lots of songs, or parts of songs, segue together in an effort to coax some energy. Here, the melodies are too incomplete, and the ideas are altogether too fragmented. To amount to much. You can't synergise something from nothing. Some of the more okay songs here would have worked as filler, but only 2 or 3 are even close to an 8 out of 10. User Coma_man says, "This one is hard to like, but individual tracks are really easy to love. Paul has experimented with various genres and production techniques, clearly working at improvising himself as a musician and band leader. It's close to his Beatles work in this respect, but at the same time, he doesn't manage to make every single individual song stand out. I shouldn't say it, but there's a lack of Lennon's input here, and it's painfully obvious." Okay, so not the best start, but let's see what someone with a more reputable mainstream establishment opinion might say in a reviewed publication. Maybe they'll have more of a subtle and nuanced opinion on the album. Timothy White for Rolling Stone said, "In keeping with the fractured nature of Back to the Egg, I offer the reader a multiple choice ending to this review with the suggestion that he or she can consider combining all of the following. A. This album is nothing more than a slipshod demo by an aimless band. If it had arrived unsolicited in the offices of Columbia, it would have been returned in the next mail with a terse no thank you. B. I could think of few other prominent rock musicians who have signed their names to this kind of drivel. McCartney's gross indulgence is matched only by his shameless indolence, and that Back to the Egg represents the public disintegration of a consistently disappointing talent. C. Paul McCartney, how does this man sleep, has been plagiarising his own material for years now, and he's finally run out of recycled ideas. With a few key word changings, the lyrics that began this piece could end it on an appropriately grim autobiographical note. D. Where have you gone, Emmett Rhodes? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you. Woo woo woo." UltimateClassicRock.com says, "McCartney seemed determined to put an ozone-scented charge into his sound after the soft rock fluff of 1978's London Town. All of the pieces were in place, but Back to the Egg didn't go far enough. Today, the album feels simultaneously like a bold move into the then current sounds of punk and new wave, but also, in particular on its second side, a retreat into some of McCartney's more recognisable indulgences, including song medleys, silly love songs, and mid-century parlour pop." Okay, again, not the best setup to get you hyped for the album ahead, because I can tell you right now, I'm not going to rip this album a new asshole like these people have just done, and neither will my guest either, so I'm sorry if I've prematurely worried any of you. No, we can put a lot of this down to various factors that were all working in conjunction to bury this album under the weight of their bullshit. Like there was the general anti-Wings sentiment after Wings at the Speed of Sound and London Town, and this anti-Wings feeling had come back into vogue in recent years, which is a nice bit of bookended symmetry to the proceedings, for me at least. There was the global financial crisis, which was fueled by oil shortages, and then which put a squeeze on a lot of spare cash in households. There was this lack of enthusiasm for the Beatles or anything Beatles related by the current youth market. There was the backlash from real punk and new wave fans who had not been happy with this album's interpretations of their own genres. There was the large portion of the current fan base who were also really turned off by their new musical direction, which didn't help. And on top of that, Paul again refused to put the highly successful A and B side singles Goodnight Tonight and Daytime Nighttime Suffering on the album. It's like the gods themselves are physically trying to stop this album from being a success. I mean, even when Paul was at knife point in Lagos, he was never faced with such odds. Conclusion. Right now, Whew, right, wow, that was a long one indeed, and we haven't even touched on the Japanese bust. Can't wait to get to that one on our next episode, McCartney 2. We're not going to do that now, and instead we're going to be patched through right to the live segment of the show, where me and a guest will once again go through the entire album song by song, giving our thoughts along the way. Now, bear with me, I tend to have some pretty major digressions with my guest before we dive into the meat of the album, so please indulge me. Hit it, Johnny. Hello, and welcome to the live portion of the show. You have, as I'm sure, just heard a very smooth-voiced, charming fellow explain to you the history of this album, the recording of it, and where Paul's head was at the time. Good. Now that we are up to date, we can get on with the show and what it's really about, discussing the album. Of course, as is the norm now, I'm not alone. My guest today is a man who I've been in correspondence with, and competition with, you might say, for quite a while now, and ever since my blog has existed anyway. When you start a Beatles blog, or a McCartney blog, or a Travelling Wilburys blog, the best way to get some exposure is to post it on various Facebook pages. You can get large numbers of views there. It's a great way to meet a wide breadth of people. And after you join all these pages, originally kind of just to start, hawking your own work, eventually you start dipping your toes into other content out there. And there was one that, no matter how fast I released an article, he would have two before I could even get my next one up. It was infuriating, and they were good. They came out better, and they came out faster, and I do enjoy them. And that is, of course, the Macca News Facebook page, the Macca News blog, of course. And its creator, Andre Homan, is with me here today, and he's been very kind to the show from the very beginning. He's a very fine Paul McCartney writer and blogger, and I'm very happy to have him on the show. Andre, how are you, my friend? Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sam. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
No, man, I wanted to have you on for a while now. You seem to be that kind of McCartney brain, that all perfect for dissecting an album like this, really.
Yeah.
I've wanted to do this episode for a while now, but life has kept getting in the way, really. I think I booked you in sometime in 2008, the first time I wanted to talk about Back to the Egg, and it's been ridiculous. One of the best things about the way we met, though, is the sense of community that's fostered amongst Paul McCartney fans and Beatles fans, and it makes you wonder if people are ever going to run out of things to talk about Paul McCartney with.
There's so much to talk about. So no, I don't think so. And he's still active, so there's still new stuff coming. Not that fast anymore, but no, there will be enough to talk about the following years, I think.
Yeah, we've got the new album coming out, obviously this year.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's going to be touring England, hopefully as well, which I'm really hoping for. Really hoping for. He was even in the news today, funnily enough. I don't know if you've seen these Quincy Jones articles that have been going around, where he was saying Paul McCartney is like the worst bass player he's ever heard, and the Beatles weren't musicians, and Kennedy was shot by the mob. Very, very weird articles I've been reading on Facebook this morning. But anyway, before we dive kind of into the yoke of Back to the Egg, I kind of did want to talk about blogging and our intense rivalry, as it were. Obviously, I haven't been uploading for a couple of months at the time of recording, but that'll all be amended by the time this goes out. Obviously, you run the Macca News blogspot, which is honestly the only other blog that I actually bother to read besides my own. Mostly just so that I don't end up copying content. When McCartney woke up and he thought he'd copied yesterday, and he had to check everywhere. And if I ever get an idea, I'm like, has the Macca News blogspot already done this? And do you ever get worried that your stuff's been done somewhere else before?
I don't know. I'm not looking that way. Mm-hmm. There are stories that have been done before, but the blogs are pretty personal. So I don't mind if someone else has the same subject on a blog, because it will be different anyway. So it's only, and I see it more as they contribute to each other.
That is right, because there really isn't anything new. This is 2018, and obviously, I guess it is just the personalities and the opinions expressed that makes those kind of things unique. But I think we've done pretty well, actually, not to tread on each other's toes. I don't think.
No.
You must have done an article on McCartney bass lines by now, or I thought there must have been some overlap somewhere.
About his bass playing, I've done that, about a year ago.
Yeah, what kind of topics do you feel are the most popular with readers of your blog? What kind of articles?
if it's about the Beatles.
Yeah,
you can't deny that. If it's Beatles related, it's more popular.
That's very true. When I did the top 20 Paul McCartney Beatles songs, it just shot to the top, and I was like, ugh.
Yeah.
I've noticed Linda McCartney's quite a popular topic as well, actually.
Yeah.
There seems to be a lot of Linda fans on Instagram and Pinterest and things like
like that. They love circulating pictures around her and stuff like that.
I'm working on a blog on Linda, planning to publish it on her the date she died. It's in April, I think. So that's in the planning.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I'm currently working on a Seaside Woman episode at the moment, and an Oriental night. And one for the Oriental Nightfish as well. I like to give Linda a little bit of a spotlight to kind of redress the balance a little bit. So what came first? Did the blog come first? Did the Facebook page come first?
Actually, the very first idea was to write a book. It didn't go too fast, so I thought that I could publish the separate chapters as a blog. At first I did it only in Dutch, but you don't get very much views, readers in the Dutch language. And I was at one point, there was a website asked, could we publish a blog from you, only you have to translate it into English. So that's how I started to translate my blogs into English. And that's how it started. And the reason why it started was that I have a couple of friends who are very into the Beatles, but are totally not interested in McCartney's solo career. And that's something I find difficult to understand.
I know exactly what you mean.
With these friends in my mind, I started actually writing my blogs, explaining why McCartney is still interested in his solo career. And that's why I started writing only about McCartney's solo and not his Beatle period. Nowadays I also write about his time in the Beatles. So. But that was the start of it.
I do understand that as well, because like as I'm going through the podcast, it's getting harder and harder not to go back and talk about more Beatles things. That's why I'm doing like the film stuff as well. Like I mean, if I can kind of just release that valve a little bit, that Beatles chat valve, I don't have to like talk about it for a while. So it's kind of a periodical thing for me definitely, because it is impossible not to talk about them every single episode, because almost every single song it reminds you of some Beatles song, or there was a Beatles song that did this kind of thing but maybe did it a little bit better. And I'm sure you've had this as well, like when you're trying to write about Wings, in the same way that McCartney had the Beatles in his shadow, you've got the Beatles in the shadow of your blog, and like just let me talk about Letting Go, please. And it's like I've got to write about Abbey Road again. I mean, obviously your Facebook page as well is one of the ways that I got started as well, so obviously I have to thank you on my podcast here now for giving it a little bit of exposure. What I like that you do though is that you will like it and share it a couple of days after everyone else does, which gives my WordPress views that little bump, and I'm like, that's Andre's share, that is there, just that little rise in views.
Is it true?
It's true.
Okay.
The views on the blog, they're consistent but low, but there's always views every day, which makes me quite glad. It's been a while now since I've had a day with 0. If I ever have another one, I think I'll just cry. But so you may or may not know, as part of the show, I like to ask some pretty broad, generic questions about Paul and the Beatles that we can kind of judge your baseline from where you're coming from musically. Don't think too hard. Just think of the first thing that comes to your mind. Ready? Here we go.
Yeah.
What is your earliest memory of either Paul McCartney or the Beatles?
My brother and my mother buying the blue and red double collection albums.
Ooh, that's a good first one to get into. That is, because that's got something for everyone. Really.
Yeah. Well, I thought if they're buying 4 records of one band, that must be special.
There must be something to this.
And that was the start. Yeah.
No, you had good instincts there. What was the first Beatles or McCartney record that you ever bought?
The Wings Over America.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Man, like I still remember back to that record shop where I bought that, and I remember this is heavy. It's a heavy piece of record, man.
Yeah, I'm still playing it every year a couple of times. It's a great album.
I listened to it the other day, and I do feel like perhaps it should have been a double album of the better songs. And I know that's kind of sacrilege, but this show's full of sacrilege. I think it could have been down to a 2 disc quite neatly. Perhaps that could be a blog post for both you and me in the future. Who knows?
Yeah. I disagree.
Oh well, maybe 2 sides of the same argument then.
Yeah.
So these friends with the Beatles, were they from youth then? Did you grow up with them, or was it more like in your teen years when you discovered the Beatles?
No, I grew up. I was about 6 years old when my brother and mother bought this record. So since 1973, 74. I'm born in 67, so about 6-7 years old. And since then, no.
Awesome. So, how long did it take you to get into McCartney from there then?
Well, it started more with McCartney than the Beatles. I've got these collection albums, but as I told you, the first one I bought was Wings Over America, and since that moment it was Wings for me. And being very young, I actually thought with these 4 albums from my family, that was actually everything the Beatles had done. I didn't know there was anything more.
That's so funny because honestly, they could have just done those 2 albums, and that would have been good enough. Really, they would have been just as famous. They would have been just as massive.
Yeah,
really.
yeah. And McCartney was releasing new stuff, so that was interesting for me.
Did you buy Back to the Egg on release?
Yeah,
or?
yeah.
Oh wow! So you're one of the people that actually bought it. Well done, McCartney. Yeah. McCartney is very, very grateful to you.
It didn't sell that bad. I know the record company at the time was very disappointed about the sales, but the fact was that there was an economic crisis going on at that time, and there weren't much albums that were selling very well. So it did commercially not that bad. Actually,
it did start off well. It was clearly bought by the Wings fans, but a lot of the previous Wings albums, like Band on the Run, was in the majority probably not bought by Wings fans. It was just bought by fans of good music, and now that kind of Venn diagram's getting ever wider, and now it's just the hardcore fans. And I mean,
that's true.
It got to number 4, so it's you've got enough hardcore fans to keep in the top 5, which isn't bad. Yeah. Last 2. What is your favourite Beatles song and album?
Oh, that's so difficult.
I'm sorry.
My iPod playlist of favorite Beatles songs contains 75 songs, I think, and choosing. There are some songs I liked as a child and still like Lady Madonna, Got to Get You Into My Life. That are 2 of my favorites. But just calling 2 favorites, there are so many more. So actually, if I say one, tomorrow it will be a different one.
Okay,
so,
your favourite song today?
I Got to Get You Into My Life then.
It's a strong one. It's a strong choice. Very, very good. And favourite Beatles album? Today.
That's a difficult one too, but I'll say Revolver.
Ooh, Revolver's the safe choice. Like no one ever got angry at someone for saying Revolver. You know what I mean?
Well, it's a tough call with Rubber Soul and Abbey Road. These are my 3 favorites.
Rubber Soul, Abbey Road, Revolver. They are the kind of the key 3 to get anyone into the band as well in that kind of mature sense. And finally, I'll do the same question again, but for McCartney. What is the best solo McCartney song and album? That does include Wings, obviously.
The fun thing, I also made in my blogs lists with best guitar songs and best piano songs or whatever. And there's one song that actually comes back in almost every list, and that's Maybe I'm Amazed. This is the ultimate McCartney song, I think. It's got this drumming, it's got this perfect guitar solo. The lyrics are great. It's a great song. So I would choose that one. But also with McCartney, there are so many songs that actually are equal good. And favorite album, that would be Ram.
You know what?
Yeah.
You're saying all the right answers today. Revolver, Maybe I'm Amazed, Ram. You're doing well. You really are. You're doing well. You're looking to come back. I like it when they're eager. That's good. That's good. Use it. So, do you feel prepared to move on to Back to the Egg for the next sort of 90 minutes now? Then.
Yeah.